There was a time in my life when certain parts of scripture made people uncomfortable, not because they didn't understand them, but because they knew the effect those words could have on a person's mind. When I was deeply involved in the occult, I remember hearing conversations about specific passages that people would avoid, not openly, not directly, but quietly, almost cautiously. One of those was a psalm. I didn't understand why at first. To me, it was just words on a page. But over time, I started noticing something. Whenever someone spoke it with confidence, something shifted, not in the environment, but in the person. Their posture changed, their tone became steady, their fear seemed to disappear. And that was something the system I was in could not control, because fear was a tool. If you keep someone uncertain, they stay dependent. If you keep them afraid, they keep searching. But the moment someone becomes grounded, truly grounded, that control begins to break. I remember a moment very clearly. Someone I knew had been constantly anxious, always worried about what was happening spiritually, always trying to figure out if something was working against them. But one day, they stopped reacting the same way. They weren't panicking anymore. They were calm. When I asked them what changed, they said something simple. I stopped looking for signs, and I started holding on to truth. And then they mentioned a psalm. At that time, I didn't fully understand what they meant. But after I left that world, I went back and read it for myself, slowly, carefully, without fear. And what I discovered was not a formula. It was something much stronger. Clarity. Because this psalm doesn't work like a spell. It doesn't operate on repetition or ritual. It shifts your focus. And when your focus shifts, your fear loses its foundation. Today, I'm going to show you what that really means. Because it's not about saying one line and expecting everything to instantly change. It's about understanding what those words do to your mind and why that changes everything. When I finally sat down and read it without fear, I realized something immediately. This psalm was never about fighting something unseen. It was about shifting your focus completely. The one that was often spoken about, the one I kept hearing referenced, was Psalm 23. At first glance, it seems simple, familiar even. But when you read it slowly, line by line, you start to notice something deeper. It doesn't tell you to search for hidden enemies. It doesn't tell you to react to every fear. It doesn't even direct your attention toward what might be against you. It does the opposite. It centers you. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. That first line alone removes pressure. It replaces uncertainty with trust. Instead of asking, what am I lacking? Your mind shifts to, I already have what I need. That's a completely different starting point. Then it continues. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul. Notice the pattern: rest, stillness, restoration, not urgency, not panic, not reaction. This is where I began to understand something I had missed for years. The power of this psalm is not in repeating it like a formula, it's in what it does to your internal state. Because when your mind is constantly searching for problems, you stay tense. But when your focus shifts towards stability and trust, your body and thoughts begin to settle. And when you are settled, fear has nowhere to grow. That's why this psalm feels different when you truly understand it. It's not trying to control your environment, it's stabilizing your perspective. And once your perspective is stable, the idea of being constantly attacked or cursed starts to lose its hold on you. Because instead of reacting to what you can't see, you become grounded in what you know. What I didn't understand for a long time is this: fear needs uncertainty to survive. When your mind is unsure, it starts searching. It looks for answers, explanations, hidden meanings. And the more it searches, the more possibilities it creates, most of them negative. That's how fear grows. But when I looked at this psalm closely, I noticed something completely different. It removes uncertainty. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. That line stood out to me more than anything, not because it denies difficulty, it clearly acknowledges it, but because of the response. I will fear no evil. That's a decision, not based on what is happening around you, but based on what you choose to hold on to internally. And that's what I had never been taught before. In the occult mindset, you are trained to react, to stay alert, to interpret everything. Fear becomes a form of awareness. You're always scanning, always trying to understand what's happening behind the surface. But here, the approach is completely different. You're not reacting, you're deciding. You're choosing not to let fear take control, even in uncertain situations. And that decision changes your entire internal state. Because when your mind is not constantly searching for threats, it begins to settle. Your thoughts slow down. Your body relaxes. You stop attaching meaning to every small experience. And that's where fear starts to disappear. Not because everything around you suddenly changes, but because your response changes. I remember the first time I applied this in a real moment. Something unexpected happened, and my mind immediately tried to go back to old patterns, analyzing, questioning, assuming something deeper was going on. But instead of following that path, I paused, and I held on to that line: I will fear no evil, not as a ritual, but as a decision. And within moments, the tension faded. The situation didn't become dramatic. It didn't spiral. It stayed simple. Because I stayed grounded. That's when I understood something clearly. The power is not in the words themselves. It's in what those words anchor inside of you. And once your mind is anchored in clarity instead of fear. Everything else begins to lose its hold. This is where most people misunderstand everything. They hear something like this and immediately turn it into a method, a formula. Say this psalm and everything will be fixed. That's exactly how I used to think. Because in the occult, everything is about formulas, specific words, specific timing, specific repetition. The idea is that if you do it correctly, you will produce a result. So when I first came across this psalm, part of me tried to treat it the same way. Repeat it enough times. Say it with intensity. Expect something immediate to happen. But nothing changed. Not because the words lacked power, but because I was using them the wrong way. This psalm is not a spell. It's not something you use to control outcomes. It doesn't operate on repetition or technique. It works through understanding. Because if you say the words, but your mind is still filled with fear, nothing shifts. You're still thinking the same way. You're still reacting the same way. You're just adding words on top of it. That's not transformation. That's surface level repetition. The real shift happens when you understand what the psalm is doing internally. It's redirecting your attention from fear to trust, from panic to stability, from searching to resting. And that shift cannot be forced through repetition. It has to be accepted. I remember the moment I realized this. I stopped trying to use the psalm and I started reading it slowly, letting each line settle. No pressure, no expectation, just understanding. And that's when something changed. My thoughts became quieter. My reactions became slower. My mind stopped jumping to conclusions, not because something outside of me shifted, but because something inside of me stabilized. That's the difference between a formula and truth. A formula tries to produce results. Truth changes your perspective. And once your perspective changes, your entire experience begins to shift naturally. That's why this psalm is powerful. Not because it instantly removes every problem, but because it removes the fear that makes everything feel overwhelming in the first place. So what does this actually do for you? Not in theory, not in expectation, but in real everyday life. It grounds you. That's the simplest and most honest answer. Because the real problem I had for years was not what was happening around me. It was how I was reacting to it. My mind was constantly searching, constantly alert, constantly trying to figure out what might be wrong. And that state of mind creates pressure. Everything feels heavier. Everything feels urgent. Everything feels like it needs to be solved immediately. But when I began to truly understand this psalm, something shifted in a very practical way. I stopped reacting so quickly. Instead of assuming something negative, I paused. Instead of searching for hidden meaning, I stayed with what was real. Instead of letting fear guide my thinking, I let clarity take its place. And that changed how I experienced everything. Situations that used to feel overwhelming became manageable. Moments that used to trigger anxiety became calm. Thoughts that used to spiral became quiet. Not because life became perfect, but because my mind became stable. And that's the real impact. This psalm doesn't remove every challenge. It removes the instability that makes challenges feel bigger than they are. It teaches you to stay grounded even when things are uncertain. It reminds you that you don't have to analyze everything. You don't have to react to every thought. You don't have to live in constant alertness. You can be still. You can be steady. You can move through your day without carrying unnecessary fear. That's what I wish I had understood earlier, because I spent years looking for something to block problems instantly, when in reality, what I needed was something that would stabilize me consistently. And once that stability is there, everything changes. You think clearly, you respond calmly, you move forward without hesitation. So if you take anything from this, let it be this. Don't treat it like a formula. Let it change how you think. Because once your thinking changes, the fear that once controlled you begins to disappear. And that is where real freedom begins.